First, apologies to the live translators. We're going to talk a bit about mining terms. We're going to talk a bit about chemistry on the demand side. And probably worst of all, you need to try to translate a Dutchman speaking English. So good luck with my accent. SFA Oxford has been around well over 20 years. We are a consulting firm based in the UK. We consult to global clients, OEMs, primary producers, and a lot of companies processing these materials. And that's the bulk of the work we do. We specialize in PGMs, but cover battery materials as well. I'm going to talk today a bit about ruthenium and iridium, often the forgotten metals, but they're very important metals to the world's GDP almost. If you look at the diversity of uses, they are very unique metals, but also impossible to displace in some cases. We're going to talk a bit about first the supply side, and that is probably the most unique part of these metals. There are only a handful of companies in the world that mine these metals, and the reason is that they've been very unfairly distributed geologically. The bulk of these metals are being mined by South African companies. There are very few metals in the world that are so concentrated in their supply, and it has to do with how they've been geologically distributed. If you look at the map, which is the bushveld in South Africa, the bushveld in South Africa has been mined for nearly a century. It's very unique geologically. It is absolutely massive, 300 kilometers across, and there's no equivalent ore body in the world. As a result, if you look at how these metals have been deposited, the bulk of your ruthenium and iridium mined globally are mined in South Africa. There are no other places to find them. What I'm also going to explain is that they're byproducts. That makes it quite difficult when you need more iridium to mine more iridium, because the main products that make your money are not necessarily iridium or ruthenium. So, in South Africa, there are three main reefs that are being mined. We have something called the Plat Reef. A lot of that is mined, or most of it is open cast. It's a bit of a lower grade, richer in base metals. We have historically been mining first the Merensky Reef, again, high in platinum, some iridium and ruthenium, and some base metals. And over the last 2 decades, UG2 Reef, which is rich in chromium in particular, has become the dominant reef that is being mined. If you look at the distribution of metals in these reefs, and that's important to remember, these are all mined together. You can't pick the one over the other. The bulk of your revenue and the bulk of the metal for every ton you mine is platinum, palladium, and rhodium. And you can also see that only a small percentage of that metal is actually ruthenium and iridium. And as a result, if you mine these reefs, you get some of those metals, but you can't accelerate the mining of ruthenium and iridium. It will always come with the main products, platinum, palladium, and rhodium, which are determining your economics. UG2, and that's the good thing that has happened in South Africa over the years, we've been mining more and more UG2, happens to be the richer reefs in ruthenium and iridium. If you look at how the revenue stacks up, that's for 2024. Ruthenium and iridium, on average, only contribute 10-11% of South African producers' income. And if you then look at the price sensitivity of these metals, and this is on 2024 prices, you have to push prices up very hard. In the case of iridium, doubling iridium prices, you start to make a slight difference to the income basket of the South African producers. But it's important to remember that the sensitivity of the company's economics to iridium and ruthenium is very limited. It's a nice to have, but it doesn't determine if you're going to mine more or less of this metal. This is a picture that shows the historic South African revenue contribution of the industry over the years. And if you could go back far in time, 25 years back, for many years, platinum was the dominant contributor to revenue. Some periods, and particularly 2007-8, was a period where rhodium and palladium prices helped revenues a lot, And then again in 2020, 21, 23, rhodium and palladium prices boomed, and that really contributed to shifting revenue numbers up. The question going forward is, those particular metals, rhodium and palladium, how much will they contribute in the future to the economics of the South African miners? And platinum will become, again, the more dominant contributor. But it also shows that ruthenium and iridium don't really contribute a massive amount, no matter the price, to what the future revenues will be of the South African industry. If you look, therefore, forward, and if you look at battery electric vehicles displacing ICE to a certain extent, and we fully agree that it's not going as fast as initially believed 2-3 years ago, but at the same time, we might have reached peak ICE, and as a result, you probably will not get another rhodium price boom of $30,000. And as a result, the economics of the South African industry are strained, and as a result as well, the capital that we're putting underground to maintain production, let alone grow production, is starting to flatline and go down. And as a result, and it was mentioned by Valterra earlier as well, we probably will have a primary shrinking supply base. One of the issues that we're dealing with is that as you mine, and remember this is a dipping ore body, it goes down. The older your mines get, the deeper they go, and we're now dealing with some mines mining at depths that require significant cooling power. At 1,800 meters, 2 kilometers deep, your virgin rock temperature is 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. So you need to put lots of electricity and power into cooling those mines to make them workable. What you then also see is that as these shafts age, and some of them are 50, 60, 70 years old, they get mined out. And currently, sinking another 2-kilometer deep shaft with all its related infrastructure and preparing it for production is a 15 to 20-year process. And current boards are a bit scared to look that far in the future and spend that amount of capital, knowing your returns take so long to be achieved. So we're not necessarily convinced that we're seeing an uptick in South African production. It is a declining trend as some of these older shafts start to shut down. Now, if you look at where the bulk of current production is coming from, and if you look, we've taken the 2015 numbers, we've already started to shrink the main area of production, which is the Western Limb. That's where the richest reefs were originally, that's where the bulk of the mining was started. And those areas, the bulk of the areas, are the aging mines. And they're still going to shrink further with, as far as we can see, not too many new mines coming on that will actually put lots of extra iridium and ruthenium on the market. The Eastern Limb has grown, and mines like Northam have been putting lots of capital there, and that's where ruthenium and iridium has been growing, but it's not enough to offset the decline in the large, deep-level mines that we see on the Western Limb. So, if you look at what historically has been happening to ruthenium and iridium, there has been a slight decline already been seen over the last 9 to 10 years on a growth rate from the South African industry. If you look at going forward, though, in 2035, we think that decline is going to accelerate, and it largely has to do with some of the aging mines coming off the system and not being replaced by new mines. So if you average it out, and it's important to emphasize that that decline is more concentrated beyond 2030, when some of the real older mines are starting to shut down. It is therefore also a bit of a dilemma. We see very strong markets for ruthenium and iridium ahead, but the primary supply is not necessarily coming through. So, if we now talk demand, and then later on we're going to bring that together, because there are a couple of solutions for it. This is not a dramatic story, it's just how we manage the primary side versus the other factors coming into supply demand. First of all, this is a summary of the different demand sectors, and it is a very wide variety of demand. Some of the key demand sectors for ruthenium are in the chemical industry. Electrical has a great story coming up in hard disk drives. Remember, the AI boom needs lots of storage. There are new technologies coming up that don't use ruthenium, but the demand growth is so strong that the old technology will continue to consume and grow ruthenium demand for years to come, in our view. If you look at the iridium side, we have some big chemical bulk industries using iridium, and iridium is quite a unique metal. It can withstand high temperatures, aggressive chemical environments, and as a result, as a catalyst and as a node covering, it works exceptionally well from a durability perspective in some of these very harsh chemical processing industries. The diversity of demand is good, but there are also alternatives available, and we're going to talk a bit about that later, because, for example, in automotive, as prices for iridium started to rise and the spark plug tips became an issue, we're seeing some of the ruthenium displacing iridium in those applications. And we think there are other PGM opportunities here as well in certain use cases when prices would rise to levels where it becomes uneconomic to use some of these metals. If you break down the history of some of that demand, and that is the attractive part of it, we do expect quite a bit of ruthenium demand growth in the hydrogen sector, particularly in the formation of ammonia. We think ruthenium can play a great role there. And we think that in some of the technology disruptions we're going to see, ruthenium is going to play an important role. And we do think that the growth rate of demand is actually healing. Now, this is where we have a bit of a dilemma. We have primary supply coming off, and we have the growth rates going forward in these metals going up, and we need to solve for those. In iridium, we are optimistic on hydrogen, but I've given you the forecast till 2035. That demand pickup is probably post-2030, because there's been quite a slowdown, we think, in the hydrogen story. We're going to talk a bit about that just now as well. When we look at hydrogen, and you go back to 2020, there was an enormous rush globally, be it the US, be it Europe, be it China. We need to get the hydrogen economy going. Lots of projects were announced. Lots of government policies were implemented. The reality is, though, that a lot of these projects are currently being postponed, cancelled, or scaled down. The US has come up with a pretty aggressive anti-hydrogen strategy under Trump. Europe has had a bit of a reset as well. China is still very positive and probably will take the lead. But we are in a reflection moment. We think there's going to be a bit of a shakeup, because it was a period where any nail out there was trying to be hit with a hydrogen hammer. And there's a lot of applications where you should not use hydrogen. And I think that clean out is currently happening. So what we did was we relooked at all the projects being announced. We saw the cancellation rate, and the iridium boom for now is much more modest in our view than what we previously saw. We should also not forget that this is a combination of projects being taken off the table, thrifting of iridium use, a more efficient use of iridium in a lot of these PEM catalysts, for example, and fuel cells, and efforts in using, for example, ruthenium in certain applications mixed with iridium in order to optimize iridium use. We think that rebuilding all of confidence in the hydrogen sector will result in an increased demand, but it will likely happen now post-2030. We've already mentioned Europe and US are definitely weakening. China is still the one that is putting proper momentum behind it, and that's the one that probably will be driving most of the growth going forward over the next few years in trying to maximize the opportunity there. Now, how do we solve for this dilemma of falling primary supply and rising demand? First of all, this is a bit of historical context. We've been mining iridium and ruthenium for over 100 years, and over the last, call it 30, 40 years, it has started to scale up properly, and partly because of UG2 mining becoming a key source of platinum, palladium, and rhodium supply in South Africa. There has been, as a result, a lot of metal, iridium, ruthenium, being put into, call it the global stocks, floating stocks. Some of this is obviously permanently lost in some chemical processes. We do think there is a mine of material still out there that has already been mined and could be accessed for certain portions of the recycling chain. There is also, and that is often not shown in the supply-demand side, a very active closed-loop recycling circuit already. And to just highlight how big a portion that is of the existing iridium market, we estimate that nearly 3/4 of current iridium use is serviced by active recycling circuits, closed-loop recycling mainly. Some of that recycling needs top-up, and that's why we will never get rid of primary production. But there is already quite an efficient recycling circuit. Ruthenium, not as yet as big as iridium, but we think there are further opportunities in the ruthenium recycling space that could boost that number as well. Now, that gives you a lot of flexibility if prices would rise in these metals. And remember, ruthenium has already risen 60-70% over the last few weeks. There will be initiatives to actually recover more of this metal because it will start to pay. What is also important that in a lot of the applications, there are alternative catalysts available. Now, we don't take this lightly. You have to remember that catalysts are often a certain proportion of a capital build. Processes are often optimized around a certain catalyst. A lot of learnings of industrial processes around iridium, ruthenium catalysts have taken 20, 30 years to get there. So it's not easy to switch out. But there are certain applications where there are opportunities to use either less metal or an alternative PGM metal or a non-PGM metal. And that also gives, because of its wide variety of uses, flexibility to actually displace some of the existing ruthenium and iridium users if new applications come up that need it. And for example, the hydrogen sector coming up, it is essential that some of the existing users will start to yield some of the metals they're using to make sure that the hydrogen economy actually stays affordable. Now, if we then add it all up, looking back, we believe the ruthenium market had for many years, and it was one of the reasons why prices were low. Some of the producers kept a lot of this metal in their cupboard because there wasn't any demand for it. There have been significant resets to pricing, though, over the years. And I think the appreciation of what these metals can do, the catalytic activity, scarcity, the ability to hold up in certain chemical processes has moved these prices to a permanently higher level. If we look forward beyond 2025, we can see deficits developing in both these markets. There should be price supportive. It is also important to remember that these prices, if they go higher, are not necessarily going to trigger new production from South Africa. We see a shifting of demand applications among that pie chart we showed. We see some other metals taking some of the pressure off the ruthenium use that we envisage. In ruthenium in particular, we think there's a couple of new applications coming that are going to be quite metal intensive. So ruthenium prices have a very strong underpin going forward. But importantly, the South African producers are the producers to speak to for new metal. It is very unlikely we will find new resources of ruthenium and iridium from a primary perspective. I thank you for your attention. If there is any further questions, I'm happy to answer those questions afterwards. Thank you.